Rome did not collapse with a sound loud enough to wake anyone. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. It settled instead, slowly, like dust in a room no one cleaned anymore. The lamps were still lit. The voices were still confident. The rituals continued on schedule. From the outside, everything looked intact. Inside, something had already loosened. This story does not begin with betrayal or blood. It begins with a system insisting it was healthy long after it stopped responding, and with a man who accidentally proved that insistence wrong. The Roman Republic had always been proud of its balance, power shared between offices, authority restrained by tradition, ambition slowed by procedure. It was a system designed to prevent any single figure from rising too far, too fast. And for centuries, it worked well enough. But by the 1st century BCE, Rome was no longer the city this system had been built for. It was an empire stretched across seas and continents, governing provinces that could not be imagined when its laws were first carved into stone. Armies fought far from Rome. Wealth flooded in unevenly. Problems multiplied faster than debates could contain them. The structure remained the same, but the weight it carried had changed. The Senate responded not with reform, but with reassurance. Everything was fine, they said, loudly and often. Procedures were sacred. Precedents were respected. Stability was praised as a virtue rather than questioned as a habit. Corruption was everywhere, but so familiar, it became invisible. Bribes were not scandals. They were tools. Alliances shifted constantly. Loyalty traded like currency, yet all of this was framed as politics, functioning normally. The Republic was not breaking, it was adapting. At least that was the story they told themselves. In truth, the system had grown slow. It could delay, obstruct, and negotiate endlessly, but it struggled to act. Decisions required compromise among men whose primary goal was not governance, but survival within the hierarchy. The Republic had learned how to preserve itself, but forgotten how to move. This did not feel dangerous to those in power. It felt comfortable. Comfort, after all, is excellent at disguising decay. Julius Caesar did not enter this world as a destroyer. He entered it as a participant who took the rules seriously enough to use them fully. He campaigned. He formed alliances. He climbed the political ladder with an intensity that unsettled those who preferred the latter remain symbolic. Caesar treated politics as something meant to produce outcomes rather than preserve appearances. This alone made him unusual. He did not wait patiently for problems to solve themselves. He solved them. What truly disturbed the Senate was not that Caesar ignored tradition, but that he worked within it and still succeeded. He delivered results where others delivered speeches. He made decisions visible to ordinary Romans, not just legible to aristocrats. Debt relief, land distribution, public projects. These were not revolutionary ideas, but they were executed with speed and clarity that made the rest of the political class appear decorative. Nothing exposes weakness faster than comparison, especially when the comparison is unflattering. The public noticed. Support gathered around Caesar not because he promised grand ideology, but because life felt slightly more manageable under his influence. The Senate had grown accustomed to admiration rooted in ancestry and reputation. Caesar earned it through action. This unsettled a political culture that relied on inherited authority. Popularity, when earned rather than inherited, is a dangerous skill. It creates loyalty that cannot be negotiated away. Still, nothing had collapsed yet. There were no daggers, no conspiracies whispered in dark corridors, just discomfort. The quiet realization that the old system could no longer control the forces it had unleashed. Rome was powerful, wealthy, and vast, but its political frame was too small for the reality it governed. Caesar did not create this problem. He merely stood in the center of it, demonstrating with every success how fragile the structure had become. The Republic had tolerated ambition for generations, as long as it remained slow, ceremonial, and manageable. Caesar's ambition moved faster than the rituals designed to contain it. He did not announce the system's weakness. He revealed it by leaning slightly against it. And once a crack is heard, even faintly, it becomes impossible to unhear. This is where the story truly begins. Not with violence, but with denial. A republic insisting it was eternal while struggling to keep up with its own empire. Caesar would soon become the focus of fear and blame. But the truth is quieter and less comforting. The Republic was already tired. Caesar was simply the man who proved it by accident. The man who took the system seriously. Julius Caesar did not arrive in Roman politics as a thunderclap. He arrived as a man willing to stay awake while everyone else pretended to rest. In a city where ambition was admired only when it moved slowly and asked permission at every step, Caesar moved with an uncomfortable sincerity. He believed the system should function, not symbolically, not ceremonially, functionally. This alone made him strange. Rome was full of talented men. It was far less comfortable with men who insisted on using that talent efficiently. Caesar was born into an old family with a famous name and very little money. This detail mattered more than later admirers liked to admit. He did not inherit power in the way many senators did. He had to build it. Reputation, wealth, alliances, enemies, all of it acquired deliberately, often expensively, sometimes recklessly. He borrowed heavily. He made promises generously. He understood that visibility mattered more than caution in a political culture addicted to recognition. If Rome rewarded spectacle, Caesar was willing to provide it. The Republic offered a ladder, but it was designed to slow climbers, not encourage them. Offices came in a set order. Each step required patience, deference, and the blessing of men who benefited from delay. Caesar climbed anyway. He campaigned tirelessly. He spoke directly to the people rather than exclusively to his peers. He spent money he did not have to gain loyalty he could not otherwise access. To conservative senators, this looked irresponsible. To Caesar, it looked like investment. What separated him from his contemporaries was not charisma alone, though he had plenty. It was his refusal to treat politics as theater detached from consequence. Many Roman politicians excelled at speeches that moved nothing and debates that resolved nothing. Caesar wanted results. He passed laws that mattered to ordinary Romans. He addressed debts. He redistributed land. He sponsored public games not merely as tradition, but as a transaction. Support was earned, not assumed. This approach unsettled the Senate because it disrupted a delicate balance of mutual inefficiency. A system that moves slowly allows everyone to remain equally ineffective without standing out. Caesar stood out immediately. His success made the failures of others visible. That visibility felt personal. In Rome, where honor functioned as currency, embarrassment was a political injury. When Caesar left Rome to govern and later to command armies, the discomfort followed him rather than fading. His military career did not merely add glory, it added proof. In Gaul, Caesar achieved what Roman politics rarely produced: clear victories, clear narratives, clear outcomes. He fought wars successfully and then wrote about them with precision, turning campaigns into literature that circulated back home. Senators received updates that were efficient, confident, and impossible to ignore. Caesar was not just winning, he was narrating his victories before anyone else could reinterpret them. His soldiers adored him, not in the abstract way men respect distant commanders, but personally. He shared hardship, he rewarded loyalty, he remembered names. This kind of leadership creates devotion that no decree can manufacture. From the Senate's perspective, this was deeply alarming. Rome was comfortable with generals who returned quietly, surrendered their armies, and faded back into political obscurity. Caesar did none of these things. He returned in reputation before he returned in person. The problem was not that Caesar broke the rules. It was that the rules failed to restrain him. The Republic had mechanisms designed for a city that feared kings. Those mechanisms struggled when confronted with a man who accumulated influence across multiple spheres at once: political office, military command, public affection, literary fame, wealth. None of these were forbidden individually. Combined, they became unsettling. To ordinary Romans, Caesar looked like progress. To the Senate, he looked like exposure. Their authority had always relied on the assumption that no one man could outperform the collective. Caesar disproved that assumption repeatedly. He made the Republic look inefficient by comparison, not through sabotage, but through competence. This is a deeply uncomfortable way for a system to be challenged. As his popularity grew, so did the language of concern. Senators began to speak more frequently about tradition, about balance, about the dangers of ambition. These speeches were sincere in tone, but selective in memory. Rome had always celebrated ambitious men as long as they failed at the appropriate moment or knew when to stop. Caesar did not stop. He treated success as something to be extended rather than apologized for. There was also envy, though it rarely admitted its name. Caesar had something many senators lacked: momentum. He moved from victory to victory without pausing long enough for doubt to settle. Momentum is intoxicating to its owner and terrifying to observers. It suggests inevitability. In a political culture obsessed with precedent, inevitability feels like a threat. Still, at this stage, the Republic could have adjusted. It could have reformed. It could have acknowledged its limits and adapted its structures. But reform requires agreement, and agreement requires trust. The Senate trusted tradition more than solutions. Tradition had always protected their status. Solutions might redistribute it. Caesar did not announce himself as a savior. He did not claim destiny. He simply continued doing what he had always done, taking the system at its word. If laws existed to be used, he used them. If offices existed to govern, he governed. If Rome claimed to value results, he delivered them. The contradiction was not in Caesar's behavior. It was in Rome's expectations. By the time Caesar's name dominated conversations, the Republic had already framed the conflict incorrectly. They spoke as if Caesar were the problem rather than the symptom. He was not tearing the system apart. He was revealing how little force it took to make it bend. That realization lingered uncomfortably in the Senate chambers. If one man could achieve so much so quickly, what did that say about decades of careful obstruction? The Republic had grown used to men who managed decline gracefully. Caesar managed success aggressively. This difference altered the emotional climate of Roman politics. Fear entered quietly, disguised as concern. Admiration hardened into suspicion. Support began to look like threat. Caesar's achievements stopped being impressive and started being alarming, not because they were harmful, but because they worked. And so the stage was set, not for immediate violence, but for a shift in perception. Caesar was no longer just a capable politician. He was becoming a mirror held too close. The Senate did not like what it saw reflected back. A system that prided itself on balance now depended on a single man's restraint. That is not a position any republic enjoys. The tragedy of this moment lies in its subtlety. Nothing dramatic had happened yet, no line crossed, no crown offered, just a growing realization that the Republic no longer controlled its most successful servant. Caesar had taken the system seriously, far more seriously than it was prepared to be taken. And in doing so, he exposed a truth Rome was not ready to face. That effectiveness, once demonstrated, cannot be unseen. And those who benefit from stagnation rarely forgive the man who proves it unnecessary. Popularity is a dangerous skill. There is nothing inherently illegal about being liked. Roman law never forbade admiration, applause, or loyalty freely given. Yet in Rome, popularity had always been treated with suspicion, especially when it grew faster than tradition could explain. The Republic tolerated fame when it arrived slowly, diluted through generations, inherited rather than earned. What it did not tolerate well was affection that formed quickly and attached itself to a living, breathing man who could still act on it. Julius Caesar discovered this not through theory, but through experience. Wherever he went, people gathered, not because he demanded it, but because he produced conditions that made daily life feel slightly less precarious. His reforms were practical rather than poetic. Debts eased, land redistributed, public works visible enough to be felt rather than merely announced. To ordinary Romans, this felt like attention. And attention, when rare, becomes loyalty. The Senate had long relied on distance as authority. Their power was elevated, abstract, and often inaccessible. Caesar closed that distance. He spoke plainly. He stood among the people. He treated crowds not as risks to be managed, but as partners to be convinced. This alone disrupted the emotional economy of Roman politics. Affection shifted away from institutions and toward a person. Institutions noticed immediately. Popularity in Rome had always been acceptable as decoration, triumphs, honors, statues, applause at the right moments. But it was meant to end there. Caesar's popularity did not stop politely. It followed him home. It lingered. It translated into influence. Influence that did not require senatorial permission. What frightened the Senate most was not that the people loved Caesar. It was that they loved him for reasons the Senate could not easily undermine. He did not rely on myth or lineage alone. He delivered outcomes. Criticizing him meant criticizing results that people could point to in their own lives. This is an awkward position for any political class, accustomed to controlling narratives rather than consequences. As Caesar's popularity expanded, the language around him shifted. Admiration quietly transformed into anxiety. Senators began to speak of precedent, balance, and restraint. They warned of dangerous ambition. Yet many of these men had pursued ambition their entire lives. The difference was not desire. It was effectiveness. Caesar made ambition visible by fulfilling it. The Republic had always functioned on an unspoken agreement. Power would circulate slowly. No one would move too far ahead of the group. Failure was acceptable. Success without pause was not. Caesar violated this agreement not by declaration, but by momentum. He continued moving when others expected him to stall. This momentum created a new problem: loyalty. Caesar's supporters were not bound by obligation alone, they were bound by gratitude. Soldiers who had marched with him through hardship trusted him personally. Citizens who benefited from his reforms trusted him emotionally. These forms of loyalty do not dissolve when asked politely. They cannot be legislated away. To the Senate, this felt dangerously close to something they did not have language for without invoking fear. In Rome, fear often masqueraded as principle. Senators framed their unease as concern for the Republic. They warned that no man should be indispensable, that the state must never rely on a single figure. These statements were philosophically sound and conveniently timed. What they avoided admitting was simpler. Caesar had become more relevant than they were. Relevance, once lost, is rarely forgiven. Caesar did not help matters by continuing to succeed. His victories accumulated, his visibility increased. He wrote, he spoke, he acted, he understood something his peers often forgot. Politics is not only about power, it is about perception. Caesar controlled his story while others argued over procedure. He narrated himself as Rome's most capable servant, and the story stuck. This unsettled the emotional hierarchy of the Republic. Senators were accustomed to being respected by default. Caesar earned respect dynamically. The difference mattered. Respect that must be earned can shift. Respect inherited is static. The people responded to movement. The Senate preferred stillness. As admiration for Caesar grew, the Senate's fear deepened into something more corrosive: comparison. Standing next to Caesar made others look ineffective. This was not a moral failure, it was a logistical one. Caesar completed tasks, he solved problems, he moved quickly. In doing so, he highlighted the inefficiencies others had normalized. Exposure replaced competition. That exposure felt personal. The Senate began to sense that their authority was becoming optional. When Caesar acted, things happened. When they debated, time passed. This was not lost on the public. Popularity shifted, not because Caesar demanded it, but because outcomes followed him. Popularity, in this form, became a dangerous skill. It bypassed institutions. It rendered obstruction visible rather than procedural. Still, Caesar did not claim kingship. He did not announce revolution. He continued behaving as though the Republic's rules applied, even as those rules struggled to contain him. This confused his opponents. They wanted a villain who openly rejected tradition. Caesar respected tradition while outperforming it. This made him harder to attack. The Senate's response was emotional before it was strategic. Fear hardened into resentment. Resentment disguised itself as concern. They told themselves they were protecting Rome from tyranny. But beneath the rhetoric lay something quieter and more human. They feared becoming irrelevant. In a society where honor defined existence, irrelevance was a kind of social death. Caesar's popularity also unsettled Rome's delicate relationship with its own past. The Republic had been founded on the rejection of kings. That rejection lived on as memory rather than lived experience. Caesar's prominence threatened to awaken that memory, not because he sought a crown, but because his presence made the idea of centralized authority imaginable again. Imagination is often more dangerous than intention. Yet Caesar himself remained focused on action rather than symbolism. He accepted honors with casual confidence. He did not dramatize them. This too unnerved observers. Declining honors would have reassured the Senate. Accepting them suggested comfort. Comfort suggested permanence. Permanence frightened everyone. The people, meanwhile, did not speak in abstractions. They spoke in experience. Life felt more manageable. Order felt closer. Caesar felt present. Institutions rarely inspire affection. Individuals do. The Republic had relied on loyalty to an idea. Caesar inspired loyalty to a person. That shift altered the emotional foundation of Roman politics. The Senate responded by drawing lines in language rather than law. They spoke of danger without naming it. They warned of monarchy without accusation. This ambiguity allowed fear to grow without confrontation. Caesar became a shape onto which anxieties could be projected. He was no longer just a man. He was a possibility. The tragedy of this phase lies in its gradualism. Nothing snapped, nothing broke. The Republic did not fall, it drifted. Trust eroded quietly. Admiration became threat. Success transformed into suspicion. Caesar's popularity, earned through effectiveness, revealed a truth Rome had long avoided: that systems built on tradition alone struggle when confronted with competence. By the end of this stage, the conflict was no longer about policy. It was about perception. Caesar was not accused of crimes. He was accused of being too effective, too visible, too loved. These are not charges easily defended against. Popularity had become his greatest strength and his most dangerous liability. Rome had reached an uncomfortable realization. It no longer feared what Caesar had done. It feared what he could continue to do. The Republic had survived incompetence for centuries. It was not prepared to survive success that did not ask permission. And so popularity, once a reward, became a warning. Not because it corrupted Caesar, but because it exposed the fragility of a system that relied on everyone failing at roughly the same pace. Caesar had not broken the Republic. He had simply moved faster than it could tolerate. And in Rome, moving faster than tradition often feels indistinguishable from treason. Fear wears the mask of principle. Fear rarely introduces itself honestly. It prefers a better costume. In Rome, that costume was principle. As Julius Caesar's influence continued to expand, the Senate did not openly confess its anxiety. Instead, it reached for language that sounded noble, ancient, and responsible. They spoke of tradition. They spoke of balance. They spoke of the Republic as if it were a fragile heirloom that needed constant protection from careless hands. It was a persuasive performance, especially to the men delivering it. The Republic had always relied on ideals to justify power: liberty, shared authority, resistance to kings. These concepts were deeply ingrained, taught not only as political values but as moral ones. To question them felt like treason against memory itself. When fear arrived, these ideals provided excellent cover. One could claim to be defending the Republic while quietly defending personal relevance. The two sounded remarkably similar when spoken aloud. Caesar's continued success made this language necessary. It allowed senators to criticize him without naming their real discomfort. They did not say he embarrassed them. They said he endangered Rome. They did not say he made them obsolete. They said he threatened liberty. The transformation of fear into principle was subtle and effective. Even the men delivering these speeches began to believe them. Publicly, the Senate framed the conflict as philosophical. Should any one man hold too much influence? Should the Republic rely on personal authority rather than institutions? These were reasonable questions. Rome had asked them before. What made this moment different was the timing. These concerns intensified, not when Caesar acted recklessly, but when he acted effectively. Principle arrived precisely when comparison became unavoidable. Caesar, for his part, did little to ease the tension. He continued behaving as though results mattered more than reassurance. He accepted honors with an ease that suggested he expected them. He did not cloak his ambition in false humility. This was not arrogance so much as consistency. He believed success deserved recognition. To a Senate accustomed to ceremonial modesty, this felt unsettlingly honest. Fear deepened as Caesar's presence began to reshape political reality. Senators noticed that when Caesar spoke, debates ended. When Caesar proposed, decisions followed. The Republic's rituals continued, but they felt increasingly decorative. Authority drifted, not through force, but through attention. People listened to Caesar because things happened afterward. They listened to the Senate because tradition required it. This shift alarmed men whose identity depended on institutional centrality. To lose influence quietly is worse than losing it dramatically. There is no moment to protest, no clear injustice to point to. There is only the slow realization that one's voice matters less than it once did. Fear of this realization pushed senators toward moral language. Morality offers clarity where emotion does not. The word king began to surface more frequently, carefully, indirectly. No one accused Caesar of seeking a crown outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they hinted. They warned. They reminded audiences of Rome's ancient hatred of monarchy. The implication hovered without settling. Caesar did not need to wear a crown to trigger the fear associated with one. He only needed to appear comfortable with power. This discomfort intensified as Caesar accepted honors that blurred lines: a golden chair, special robes, statues placed among those of gods. None of these actions constituted kingship. All of them suggested permanence. Permanence is what Rome feared most. Temporary power could be tolerated. Indefinite influence could not. The Senate had always allowed exceptional authority during emergencies. The problem was that emergencies now seemed to follow Caesar everywhere. Principle provided a language for panic. Senators told themselves they were acting not out of jealousy, but out of duty. They framed resistance as sacrifice. They positioned themselves as guardians rather than competitors. This self-image mattered deeply. Men who see themselves as heroes behave differently from men who see themselves as threatened. Principle transformed fear into righteousness. Yet beneath this rhetoric lay contradictions. Many senators who warned against concentration of power had benefited from it themselves. Many who spoke of liberty had enforced policies that restricted it. The Republic was full of compromises, exceptions, and contradictions. Caesar's presence did not create these inconsistencies. It illuminated them. Illumination is rarely welcomed by those accustomed to shadow. The Senate also underestimated how fear spreads. Once introduced, it becomes contagious. Senators reinforced each other's anxieties. Conversations echoed. Rumors thickened. Caesar's every action was interpreted through suspicion. Neutral decisions felt strategic. Generosity felt manipulative. Silence felt ominous. The man had not changed. The lens had. Caesar noticed the shift, but he did not retreat. Retreat would have suggested guilt. Instead, he pressed forward, believing that continued success would eventually settle doubts. This miscalculation was subtle. Caesar understood politics. He did not fully appreciate how deeply fear resists evidence. Once a man becomes a symbol, his actions matter less than what others believe he represents. The Senate's fear was not entirely irrational. Caesar did hold unprecedented influence. He did command loyalty across social classes. He did move faster than the system. But fear rarely remains proportionate. It expands. It simplifies. It demands resolution. The Senate wanted certainty. Caesar represented uncertainty embodied. In response, senators leaned harder on history. They invoked the past as warning. Rome had expelled kings before. Rome had sworn never to tolerate one again. These stories carried emotional weight. They connected present anxiety to ancient pride. In doing so, they bypassed nuance. Caesar was not a king, but fear does not require accuracy. It requires familiarity. The Republic's ideals had become weapons, not against tyranny, but against discomfort. Principle, once meant to guide governance, now guided avoidance. The Senate avoided confronting its own inefficiency by focusing on Caesar's success. It avoided reform by framing stagnation as stability. Fear had found its mask, and it fit well. By this stage, the conflict was no longer about Caesar's actions. It was about what he represented to those watching. To the people, he represented momentum. To the Senate, he represented exposure. Fear sharpened that divide. Dialogue narrowed. Trust thinned. The tragedy of this moment is that principle itself was not the problem. Rome's ideals were real, meaningful, and worth defending. But when ideals are used primarily to soothe fear, they lose clarity. They become shields rather than guides. The Senate no longer asked how to preserve the Republic. It asked how to preserve itself within it. Caesar continued moving forward, unaware that fear had already decided his role. He was no longer merely a man, he was a test. Could the Republic survive effectiveness? Could tradition coexist with momentum? These questions hovered unanswered, heavy in the Senate chambers. Fear, once masked as principle, rarely remains content with speech alone. It demands action, not immediately, not loudly, but eventually. Rome was approaching that threshold. The language had shifted. The emotions had hardened. The story senators told themselves had become too convincing to abandon. In this atmosphere, compromise became impossible. Caesar could not stop being effective without betraying his nature. The Senate could not stop being afraid without admitting its own weakness. Between those positions lay silence, and silence in politics is rarely peaceful. By the end of this phase, Rome was no longer debating policy. It was rehearsing justification. Fear had found its moral vocabulary. Principle had been recruited. The stage was set not by hatred, but by anxiety, dignified into duty. And once fear believes itself righteous, it becomes remarkably patient, waiting calmly for the moment it believes action is inevitable. Crossing a line that was already fading. Lines feel solid only when everyone agrees they exist. The Roman Republic had lived for centuries on invisible boundaries, lines drawn not in stone but in shared understanding. A general did not bring his army into Italy. A politician did not combine too many forms of power at once. A man did not move faster than the system allowed. These rules were rarely enforced by force. They were enforced by expectation. And expectations, once weakened, fade quietly before anyone notices they are gone. By the late 50s BCE, that fading had begun. Caesar was no longer merely a successful general or a popular politician. He had become a problem of geometry, too much influence in too many places at the same time, military loyalty, popular support, legal authority, narrative control. None of these alone violated the Republic's traditions. Together, they strained them. The Senate could feel the tension even if it struggled to articulate it clearly. The immediate concern was simple. Caesar's command in Gaul was ending. Roman law required generals to lay down their imperium before entering Italy. Once disarmed, a man became vulnerable. Prosecution followed. Political enemies waited patiently for this moment. Caesar knew this. The Senate knew this. Everyone understood the ritual. It had worked before because generals usually complied. Compliance meant survival within the system, even if it came with humiliation. The Senate chose its move carefully. They did not accuse Caesar directly. They did not declare him an enemy. They issued an order: disband your army, return to Rome as a private citizen. It sounded procedural, neutral, almost polite. But beneath the formality lay an unmistakable message. Come back defenseless, trust us, nothing bad will happen. This is where Roman politics excelled. Threats delivered as invitations. Caesar hesitated. This moment has often been framed as a dramatic pause, a man staring at destiny. In truth, it was a calculation. If he complied, his enemies would destroy him legally. If he refused, he would become a criminal. The Republic had cornered him not because it wanted peace, but because it wanted control. Caesar understood that the system no longer offered him safety, only submission. Across the political landscape, fear intensified. The Senate convinced itself that forcing Caesar's hand was necessary. They told themselves they were defending the Republic. Yet they had also created a scenario in which no honorable option remained. When institutions leave no room for survival, defiance begins to look like logic rather than rebellion. The river itself was unremarkable, narrow, quiet, a geographic detail elevated by circumstance, but it marked the last agreed boundary between military authority and civil life. Crossing it with an army was forbidden. Everyone knew this. Caesar knew it too. The law was clear. The consequences were catastrophic. Civil war, chaos, bloodshed, the end of pretense. Caesar crossed anyway. This act is often described as the moment everything changed. In reality, it was the moment everything became honest. The Republic had already failed to contain him. The law had already lost its protective power. Caesar's step did not break the system. It revealed that the system no longer held. The response was immediate and deeply human. Panic. Senators fled Rome, Meetings dissolved. Orders contradicted one another. The Republic, so proud of its procedures, discovered it had no script for this situation. Authority evaporated under pressure. Caesar's army advanced not as conquerors, but as a force moving through vacuum. Cities opened their gates. Resistance dissolved before forming. What struck observers most was not Caesar's aggression, but the lack of opposition. Rome had prepared for war in theory. In practice, it had prepared for debate. Caesar moved through Italy with startling ease. This was not because he terrorized cities, but because many preferred certainty to confusion. Caesar offered momentum. The Senate offered delay. Meanwhile, the man chosen to oppose him hesitated. Pompey had prestige, experience, the backing of the Senate. What he lacked was readiness. He chose retreat over confrontation. This decision, though strategically defensible, damaged morale. Rome watched its designated defender abandon the city without a fight. Symbols matter. Retreat sends messages. Words cannot repair. Caesar did not pause to savor the moment. He moved quickly, decisively, almost impatiently. Speed was his advantage. He understood that hesitation would invite opposition. Action created facts. Facts created acceptance. By the time the Senate realized what was happening, events had outrun debate. The Republic's final illusion shattered quietly. It had relied on law without enforcement, authority without loyalty, and tradition without adaptation. Caesar's crossing forced everyone to acknowledge what had been avoided for years. Power had already shifted. The river simply made it visible. As civil war unfolded, the conflict was framed as a struggle for the Republic. In truth, it was a struggle over who embodied Rome's future. Pompey represented continuity. Caesar represented transformation. Continuity moved cautiously. Transformation moved fast. In moments of crisis, speed often feels like strength. Caesar's victories came swiftly. Pompey's forces, larger but less cohesive, faltered. Discipline outperformed prestige. Adaptability outpaced seniority. The Republic's old safeguards crumbled under battlefield reality. The war ended not with negotiation, but with flight. Pompey escaped east, seeking safety. He found death instead, murdered by those hoping to curry favor. Caesar's reaction was telling. He did not celebrate, he did not applaud. Pompey's end was not triumph. It was closure. With his rival gone, Caesar stood alone at the top of a landscape emptied of counterweight. The Republic still existed in name, but its balance was gone. Returning to Rome, Caesar found a Senate eager to survive. Titles were offered, honors granted, authority extended. The same men who had feared his power now reinforced it, hoping proximity would ensure relevance. The Republic adapted not by resisting Caesar, but by yielding to him completely. This phase is often misunderstood as the rise of tyranny. It was something quieter, a system conceding that it could no longer function without concentrating authority. Caesar accepted the role without theatrical declarations. He believed stability required decisiveness. He believed delay was the enemy. In many ways, he was right. Yet every concession carried weight. Each extension of power blurred another boundary. Temporary authority became habitual. Emergency measures extended indefinitely. The Republic's traditions bent further, not under force, but under relief. Caesar solved problems. Rome exhaled. This relief masked unease. Senators smiled while counting losses. They had survived but diminished. Their speeches mattered less. Their debates felt symbolic. Caesar acted first and asked later, if at all. The Republic had not died. It had gone quiet. The crossing of the river had not been a single transgression. It was the acknowledgement that the line had already faded. Caesar did not create that erosion. He stepped into it. And once crossed, there was no returning to the comfort of invisible boundaries. Rome now faced a reality it had long avoided. The Republic could not go back to what it was. It could only decide what it would become. Caesar believed he could rebuild it with firmer foundations. Others believed the act itself was unforgivable. The tragedy lay in timing. Reform came only after rupture. Adaptation followed collapse. Caesar's crossing forced clarity, but clarity arrived too late to preserve trust. The Republic survived the crossing in form, but not in spirit. It had traded ambiguity for certainty, and certainty carried a price. By the end of this chapter, the die was cast not just for Caesar, but for Rome. A line had been crossed, yes, but it was a line already fading, already ignored, already mourned quietly by those who sensed the old balance slipping away. Caesar's step did not end the Republic. It confirmed that it no longer knew how to protect itself from success. Winning too much, too often. Victory is usually described as a solution. In Rome, it became a complication. After the Civil War ended and Caesar stood alone, there was a brief pause, the kind that follows a storm when no one is certain whether the danger has passed or merely changed shape. The city exhaled. Roads reopened. Markets resumed their noise. Senators returned to their seats with careful smiles. On the surface, order had been restored. Underneath, something subtler had shifted. Rome had learned that one man could end chaos faster than its institutions ever could. Caesar did not return as a conqueror dripping with spectacle. He returned as a problem solver. He addressed shortages. He reorganized debt. He reformed calendars, courts, and provincial administration. These were not dramatic gestures, they were practical ones. Rome, exhausted by uncertainty, welcomed practicality with gratitude. People do not ask many questions when life feels manageable again. Relief dulls curiosity. The Senate watched this with mixed emotions. On one hand, Caesar's actions stabilized the state. That mattered. On the other, each reform reduced the Senate's relevance further. Problems once debated endlessly were now resolved swiftly. Committees dissolved into irrelevance. Speeches lost urgency. Authority continued to drain away, not seized, but surrendered. This surrender felt voluntary, even polite. The Senate granted Caesar powers incrementally. Temporary authority extended. Emergency measures renewed. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together they formed a pattern. Caesar was becoming essential. Essential figures are difficult to oppose without appearing irresponsible. Rome valued stability more than abstraction. Caesar provided it consistently. Winning too much creates a strange dilemma. Failure invites replacement. Success invites dependence. Caesar's victories had eliminated rivals, but they had also eliminated alternatives. The Republic had not planned for a scenario in which its most capable leader remained permanently necessary. It had designed its laws for rotation, not reliance. Caesar seemed aware of this tension, yet unconcerned. He believed authority should match responsibility. If he was expected to fix Rome, he would require the power to do so. This reasoning was efficient and persuasive. Efficiency often is. The problem lay not in the logic, but in its implications. Authority once expanded rarely contracts willingly. The Senate attempted to retain dignity through ceremony. Titles were offered, honors bestowed. These gestures reassured tradition even as they hollowed it out. Caesar accepted them with calm confidence. Refusal would have suggested instability. Acceptance suggested continuity. Both readings favored him. Public perception shifted quietly. Caesar was no longer seen merely as a victorious general or skilled politician. He became the figure associated with order itself. Streets were safer. Grain arrived. The calendar made sense again. These mundane improvements mattered more to daily life than constitutional purity. People trusted what worked. Trust, however, is not neutral. It accumulates. It redirects loyalty. Caesar's name began to carry reassurance. His presence implied resolution. This kind of association is powerful and deeply unsettling to institutions that rely on shared authority. The Republic had become accustomed to diffuse responsibility. Caesar concentrated it through competence. Some senators told themselves this arrangement was temporary. Once Rome stabilized, power would return to its proper channels. Others suspected differently, but remained silent. Silence in such moments is rarely agreement. It is calculation. Survival often precedes principle. Caesar's continued reforms deepened this pattern. He pardoned former enemies. This mercy was strategic and sincere. It reduced resistance. It also unsettled those forgiven. Gratitude mixed with fear. A forgiven enemy is never entirely comfortable. Mercy created obligation. Obligation created quiet loyalty. Winning also altered Caesar's own position. Success narrowed his options. Retreat would appear weakness. Sharing power would invite chaos. Every choice he made reinforced his centrality. The system adjusted around him, not the other way around. This was not tyranny imposed, it was dependence developed. The Republic's language struggled to keep pace. Senators spoke of norms while relying on exceptions. They praised tradition while voting to bypass it. Contradictions multiplied, smoothed over by the comfort of results. Caesar's presence allowed Rome to function despite its inconsistencies. That functionality became addictive. Behind closed doors, unease grew. Some senators recognized the trap. They saw that every solution strengthened Caesar further. Every crisis resolved, reduced the likelihood of restoring balance. Yet no one wanted to be responsible for destabilizing what worked. Opposition now required courage and an appetite for disorder. Few possessed both. Winning too much also changed how Caesar was seen by his enemies. He was no longer simply ambitious, he was unstoppable. That perception matters. Fear responds less to what has happened than to what seems inevitable. Caesar's success suggested permanence, even if he never claimed it. Rumors began to circulate, not accusations but questions. Would Caesar ever step down? Could he? Should he? The Senate did not ask these openly. Instead, they lingered, whispered, rehearsed internally. Caesar continued acting as though time would resolve these concerns. He underestimated how deeply fear resents patience. Public honors increased. A special chair, statues, celebrations. These gestures were meant to recognize service. they also signaled elevation. Elevation invites comparison. Comparison invites suspicion. Caesar did not demand these honors. That mattered less than the fact that he accepted them without hesitation. Comfort with power unsettles those who fear it. The people responded positively. They interpreted honors as deserved. Their perspective was practical. Caesar had delivered. Gratitude rarely interrogates symbolism. The Senate, however, read symbols obsessively. Symbols were the language of power they understood best. Each honor felt like a rehearsal for permanence. Caesar's calendar reform, mundane as it sounds, captured this tension perfectly. Time itself adjusted under his authority. Days aligned, seasons made sense. Rome lived more predictably. This was efficiency elevated to metaphor. Caesar was not merely fixing problems, he was organizing reality. Winning had also isolated him. With rivals gone, advice narrowed. Allies depended on him too heavily to challenge him. Opposition retreated into silence or resentment. Caesar moved forward surrounded by agreement that was often strategic rather than sincere. Isolation disguised as consensus is dangerous. The Republic's failure at this stage was not dramatic, it was emotional. It failed to articulate limits without collapsing into fear. It failed to reform without surrendering. It failed to confront success without feeling threatened. Caesar's victories forced Rome to confront its own inadequacy. That confrontation bred resentment rather than adaptation. Winning too much altered the moral landscape. Caesar's competence became evidence against him. His success felt unfair, not illegal, not immoral, just unsettling. Systems tolerate failure more easily than they tolerate excellence that exposes their design flaws. As months passed, the tension sharpened. Caesar continued governing. The Senate continued yielding. The public continued approving. Each group believed it was acting reasonably. Collectively, they moved toward an impasse. The tragedy lies in how rational each step appeared. Caesar acted to stabilize Rome, the Senate acted to preserve relevance, the people acted to secure comfort. No one announced an end to the Republic. It simply receded, overshadowed by a man who solved problems too efficiently to ignore. By winning too much, Caesar became indispensable. Indispensability is the most dangerous position in a republic. It invites gratitude from the many and fear from the few. Caesar stood at the center of both. Rome had entered a phase where success itself became suspect, where effectiveness bred anxiety, where stability felt temporary because it depended on one man's continued presence. The Republic had survived chaos. It was now struggling to survive competence. This stage did not end with confrontation. It ended with a quiet understanding spreading through the Senate. Caesar would not leave voluntarily. Perhaps he could not. Winning too much had narrowed his future as surely as it had narrowed theirs. The question was no longer whether Caesar threatened the Republic. It was whether the Republic could tolerate a future without him. That question hung unanswered, heavy, unavoidable. And unanswered questions, when ignored long enough, tend to seek resolution through means no one claims to want. Rome was approaching that moment not because Caesar failed, but because he succeeded too often, too completely, and for too long. When power stops pretending to be temporary. Power is easiest to accept when it promises to leave. Rome had always allowed extraordinary authority under the comforting assumption that it would eventually return home, pack its bags, and politely disappear. Temporary power felt safe because it carried an expiration date. The Republic depended on this illusion. It allowed crises to be managed without challenging the deeper belief that no one was meant to stay above the system for very long. After the Civil War, that illusion began to thin. Caesar's authority was no longer tied to a single emergency. Emergencies kept arriving, or perhaps they simply never ended. Each time Rome faced instability, the solution felt obvious. Extend Caesar's powers, renew the mandate, adjust the calendar if necessary. The city told itself this was practical. Practicality is very persuasive when exhaustion is widespread. At first, the extensions felt routine. A few months here, another term there. Nothing alarming on its own. Rome had done this before. Dictatorship, in its older form, was a tool, not a destination. Yet tools can become habits when used too often. Caesar's authority stopped feeling like a response and started feeling like infrastructure. The Senate reassured itself with procedure. Votes were taken, titles were formalized, language remained careful. Everything happened within recognizable frameworks. That familiarity mattered. It allowed senators to pretend that nothing fundamental had changed, even as their role quietly narrowed. When power stops pretending to be temporary, it rarely announces the shift. It simply keeps being renewed until the question of return feels impolite. Caesar did not frame these developments as personal ambition. He spoke of stability, of continuity, of the need to finish what had been started. These arguments resonated. Rome was tired of interruptions, tired of resets, tired of leaders who began projects only to leave them incomplete. Caesar offered completion. Completion requires time. Time requires authority. The phrase that altered everything arrived almost casually. Dictator for life. It sounded administrative, almost boring. Rome had already adjusted to dictatorship. Adding permanence felt like a small step rather than a leap. Words soften when repeated often enough. What once sounded alarming now sounded efficient. To Caesar, the title made sense. He had inherited a republic in disrepair. Rebuilding required continuity. Interruptions would invite chaos. Authority needed stability to function. This logic was difficult to refute without proposing alternatives that no longer existed. The Senate had removed or weakened every rival capable of governing independently. Caesar was not clinging to power. Power had clustered around him. The reaction among senators was complex. Some felt relief. The uncertainty had been resolved. Others felt dread. The ambiguity that had protected them was gone. Temporary power allows criticism. Permanent power demands accommodation. Accommodating power feels like surrender, even when framed as cooperation. Symbols multiplied. Honors accumulated. Chairs, robes, statues, months. None of these were declarations of kingship. All of them suggested comfort with elevation. Comfort, when observed by anxious men, reads as intention. Caesar's ease unsettled more than any decree could have. The public responded differently. Most people did not parse constitutional nuance. They noticed stability. Food arrived, roads functioned, courts moved. Life felt predictable again. Predictability breeds acceptance. Acceptance dulls alarm. The Republic's old warnings about concentrated power sounded abstract compared to full markets and orderly streets. Yet beneath this calm, tension hardened. Senators watched symbols carefully. They counted honors. They measured gestures. Caesar's refusal to dramatize his authority only intensified suspicion. If he were defensive, they might have relaxed. His calm suggested permanence. Permanence is difficult to argue with without sounding hysterical. The memory of kings lingered in Roman identity like a scar. It was old but sensitive. Any pressure near it produced reaction. Caesar never claimed the title. He did not need to. The shape of his authority invited the comparison on its own. Once imagined, it could not be dismissed. The Senate tried to manage this discomfort through interpretation. They told themselves Caesar was necessary now, but temporary in spirit. That once stability was secured, he would step aside. This belief required faith. Faith in restraint, faith in gratitude, faith that success would voluntarily reduce itself. History rarely rewards such faith. Caesar's own behavior added complexity. He accepted honors but did not demand worship. He governed decisively but not cruelly. He pardoned enemies. He sought efficiency rather than spectacle. These choices made him harder to oppose. Tyrants are easier to resist when they behave predictably. Caesar behaved rationally. Rational authority unsettles systems built on ritual. The Senate's fear began to shift from action to intention. What did Caesar want? Would he ever leave? Could he? These questions circulated without answers. Caesar seemed focused on governance rather than reassurance. He believed results would speak for themselves. Fear rarely listens to results. The moment that crystallized anxiety arrived publicly. A festival, a crown offered theatrically, a refusal performed twice. The crowd reacted loudly. They did not cheer. They recoiled. Caesar declined the crown, but the test had already succeeded. Rome's discomfort was confirmed. The rumor that Caesar wanted more did not require proof. The image alone was enough. From that point on, interpretation replaced observation. Every gesture carried weight. Every honor became evidence. Caesar's acceptance of permanence began to feel intentional, regardless of his explanations. When power stops pretending to be temporary, observers stop extending benefit of doubt. The Senate's conversations grew darker. Not openly, quietly, they discussed futures they disliked. A Rome where their role was ceremonial, where debate was symbolic, where authority flowed one way. These were not fantasies, they were plausible extensions of present trends. Fear does not require certainty, it requires momentum. Caesar underestimated this shift. He believed stability would soothe anxiety. Instead, it clarified stakes. Men who could tolerate temporary imbalance struggled with permanent recalibration. The Republic had trained its elites to expect rotation. Permanence felt like erasure. The language of defense returned. Senators spoke again of liberty, of tradition, of ancestral vows. These words had been used before, but now they carried urgency. The mask of principle hardened. Fear required action to remain credible. Caesar's centralization of power had achieved its goal. Rome functioned. But functioning came at a psychological cost. It forced Rome's elite to confront a truth they had avoided. The Republic no longer needed them as it once had. That realization was intolerable. Power, once permanent, invites judgment rather than patience. Every decision becomes evidence. Every success increases expectation. Caesar now carried responsibility not just for Rome's stability, but for its identity. That burden is heavy even when welcomed. Caesar accepted it without complaint. That acceptance frightened those watching. By this stage, opposition no longer required policy disagreement. It required existential defense. Senators did not need Caesar to fail. They needed him to stop, and stopping no longer aligned with Rome's immediate comfort. When power stops pretending to be temporary, it forces choices. Accept permanence or remove it. Rome hovered between those options, suspended by fear, gratitude, and resentment in equal measure. The tragedy was not that Caesar sought permanence. It was that permanence arrived without consent. It emerged gradually, rationally, almost politely. By the time Rome noticed, reversing course felt impossible without rupture. This part of the story does not end with violence, it ends with preparation. Minds shifting, justifications forming, lines being rehearsed, fear organizing itself into intention. Caesar continued governing. Rome continued functioning. The Senate continued smiling. But beneath the calm, decisions were being imagined that could not coexist with patience. Power had stopped pretending. And Rome, confronted with that honesty, began quietly, preparing to respond in the only way it believed remained available. The conspiracy of frightened men. Conspiracies rarely begin with courage. They begin with discomfort that refuses to go away. In Rome, that discomfort had been sitting quietly for months, maybe years, waiting for permission to speak. It lived in polite smiles, in applause given too quickly, in silences held too long. By the time it found words, it already had momentum. The Senate was not a room full of villains twirling daggers in the dark. It was a room full of men who felt themselves shrinking. Power had not been taken from them violently. It had slipped away politely, one vote at a time, one emergency at a time, one reasonable exception layered onto the next. This made it harder to protest. You cannot easily rebel against what appears sensible. Fear needed organization. That role fell naturally to those who felt most eclipsed. Cassius was not the loudest voice in Rome, but he was attentive. He noticed the shift early. He felt the weight of comparison more sharply than most. Where Caesar moved with ease, Cassius strained. Where Caesar inspired loyalty, Cassius inspired irritation. These are not crimes, but in a political culture built on prestige, they are injuries. Cassius spoke first in private, not accusations, questions. Are we comfortable with this? Do we believe this ends well? He framed concern as foresight. He framed resentment as vigilance. This language worked. It allowed others to nod without committing. Agreement formed slowly, safely, disguised as conversation. What united these men was not ideology, it was anxiety. They feared a future where their relevance was decorative, where debate was ceremonial, where approval replaced authority. Caesar did not need to persecute them for this fear to feel real. His success made it inevitable. The conspiracy grew the way rot spreads in quiet wood, gradually, invisibly. No single meeting created it. No dramatic oath bound it together. Instead, conversations overlapped, grievances aligned. Men who rarely agreed found common ground in unease. Fear simplified differences. They told themselves a story. Stories are essential to action. This one was elegant. They were not plotting murder. They were preserving the Republic. They were not betraying a man. They were saving an idea. This narrative mattered. It transformed hesitation into duty. Yet the story required credibility. Cassius understood this. Fear alone could not carry public acceptance. The conspiracy needed a face that symbolized virtue rather than resentment. It needed a man whose name meant something older than Caesar's success. It needed Brutus. Brutus did not resemble a conspirator. He was reflective, philosophical, earnest to the point of discomfort. He believed in the Republic not as an instrument of power, but as a moral inheritance. His ancestry carried weight. His family name echoed with the memory of Rome's rejection of kings. That echo was irresistible to men searching for justification. Cassius approached Brutus carefully, praise first, respect, appeals to legacy. He did not demand action, he invited reflection. What would Rome become if Caesar remained? What would history say of those who watched and did nothing? These questions lingered because they touched something Brutus valued deeply: identity. Brutus struggled. Loyalty pulled him one way, principle another. Caesar had trusted him, promoted him, protected him, yet Brutus carried the burden of ancestry like a second spine. The Republic was not just a system to him. It was a moral obligation inherited rather than chosen. The conspiracy needed Brutus more than Brutus needed the conspiracy. His involvement transformed private fear into public righteousness. Once he joined, hesitation evaporated. Men who had wavered committed. Doubt collapsed into momentum. The story solidified. Planning followed belief. Details were discussed with less care than confidence. The conspirators were senators, not professionals of violence. They imagined the act as symbolic, clean, almost ceremonial. Remove the man. Restore the Republic. The simplicity of this vision was comforting. They underestimated what removal would require. They overestimated what restoration would deliver. This imbalance went unnoticed because fear had already convinced them the act itself was enough. Consequences were someone else's problem, preferably history's. The location was chosen for convenience and symbolism. The Senate meeting would provide access. Ritual would provide cover. Caesar would arrive unguarded, trusting the men he had pardoned and elevated. Trust is efficient. It reduces friction. It also creates vulnerability. Warnings circulated in the city. Omens, dreams, whispers. Rome was never short of signs. Caesar heard them, acknowledged them, and dismissed them. He believed fate favored decisiveness. He'd been right often enough to trust that belief. Confidence, when rewarded repeatedly, becomes habit. The conspirators watched these moments with growing tension. Each delay felt dangerous. Each warning ignored felt like permission. They mistook opportunity for inevitability. Fear accelerates time. It convinces men that waiting is riskier than action. On the morning itself, uncertainty flickered. Some hesitated, some rehearsed. None withdrew. Withdrawal would have required admitting doubt, and doubt threatened the story they told themselves. Once fear becomes narrative, abandoning it feels like betrayal of purpose. The gathering began normally. Senators rose, greetings exchanged. Caesar took his seat. Familiarity dulled alarm. The conspirators moved closer, their proximity disguised as respect. Respect is an excellent disguise. The signal came clumsily. The first blow was poorly aimed. Panic replaced choreography. What followed was not a clean execution, but a collapse of restraint. Blades flashed without precision. Fear, once contained, exploded. Caesar resisted, not heroically, instinctively. He struggled against men he recognized, men he had forgiven. The chaos betrayed the fantasy. This was not a surgical act of liberation. It was a frightened group improvising violence. When Brutus appeared among the attackers, something shifted. Resistance drained. The betrayal landed heavier than any wound. Caesar ceased fighting. Dignity replaced struggle. He covered his face. The gesture was small. Its meaning was not. The act ended abruptly. Silence followed. Blood pooled. The conspirators stood stunned, surrounded by the evidence of their decision. The moment they had imagined for weeks felt nothing like expectation. Relief did not arrive. Triumph did not materialize. They emerged into the city shouting slogans of liberty. The response was confusion, not celebration. People closed doors. Shops shuttered. Rome did not erupt with gratitude. It braced. The conspirators had planned an act, not a future. They assumed removal equaled resolution. Instead, they created vacuum. Vacuums attract force. Rome had plenty of it waiting. In the days that followed, their story unraveled. The public mourned Caesar. His death felt personal. He had not been distant authority. He had been presence. Gratitude turned to anger. Anger seeks direction. The conspirators discovered that fear does not vanish when acted upon. It transforms. Their fear of Caesar became fear of the crowd, fear of soldiers, fear of consequences they had not imagined. The republic they claimed to save did not reappear. It had no voice, no body, no momentum. The idea alone could not govern. Caesar's absence did not restore balance. It exposed absence. The conspiracy had been born from fear of irrelevance. Its result ensured it. The men who struck believed they were acting for Rome. Rome did not recognize the gift. This part of the story ends not with justice or clarity, but with realization. Fear had convinced reasonable men that violence would resolve anxiety. Instead, it amplified it. The Republic had not been rescued. It had been abandoned by those too afraid to imagine living within change. The conspiracy of frightened men achieved its goal. Caesar was gone. What remained was a city awake, angry, and uncontained. And fear, having proven it could act, prepared to watch what it had unleashed. The crowd that did not know it was choosing an empire. Crowds rarely wake up intending to change history. They gather for reasons that feel small at the time. Curiosity, habit, a sense that something important is happening, and it would be impolite to miss it. On the day of Caesar's funeral, Rome did not arrive as a revolution. It arrived as an audience. The city was quiet in a way that felt temporary. Doors were open but cautious. People moved slowly, watching each other as much as the streets. No one quite knew what to expect. The men who called themselves liberators had vanished into safety, waiting for approval that never came. The Republic, supposedly restored, remained invisible. What was visible was a body, laid out publicly, unmistakably real. Caesar's death had not resolved anything. It had suspended everything. Rome hovered between disbelief and anger, unsure which emotion to trust. Grief takes time to find its direction. In that waiting space, perception is fragile. Mark Antony understood this. He did not rush. He allowed the silence to thicken. He let the crowd gather not as participants but as witnesses. He did not accuse. He did not shout. He presented himself as restrained, almost reluctant. Restraint feels honest when emotions are high. It suggests control. The body spoke before he did. The wounds were visible, too many to ignore. They required no interpretation. Violence explains itself. The crowd leaned closer. Familiar faces searched for familiar explanations. None arrived. Antony began softly. He spoke of Caesar not as a ruler, but as a man, a leader who had returned power to Rome, not seized it, a benefactor who had distributed wealth rather than hoarded it. He reminded them of gifts they had already accepted. Acceptance creates obligation. Obligation invites re-evaluation. He named the conspirators without attacking them. He praised their honor while questioning their actions. This contradiction unsettled the crowd. Praise disarmed resistance. Doubt slipped in quietly behind it. Then he revealed the will. The crowd listened as beneficiaries. Each person present became involved. Caesar had left them something tangible: money, public spaces, proof of care. Gratitude shifted from abstract to personal. Personal gratitude does not remain calm for long. The crowd's grief found a shape. It hardened. Anger prefers clarity. Antony provided it without ever demanding it. He did not direct the crowd. He allowed them to direct themselves. Emotion spread quickly. Tears became murmurs. Murmurs became shouts. The story changed shape in real time. Caesar was no longer a fallen leader. He was a wronged protector. The conspirators were no longer guardians. They were thieves of stability. The funeral pyre ignited more than wood. Flames attract symbolism. The crowd surged closer, compelled by heat and feeling alike. Objects were thrown into the fire: benches, decorations. Anything nearby became an offering. Ritual turned into rage. The crowd moved next. It needed direction. It found it instinctively, toward the homes of the conspirators, toward symbols of betrayal. The city's order collapsed into momentum. No one stopped to ask what came after. They were too busy reacting to what had just been understood. This was not a planned uprising. It was a release. Years of frustration, fear, and dependency discharged at once. The Republic had offered principles. Caesar had offered presence. In his absence, presence was missed more than principle. The conspirators scattered. They had misjudged the crowd completely. They believed Rome would recognize the removal of power as liberation. Instead, Rome recognized it as theft. The men who had imagined themselves heroes discovered that heroism requires consent. As the city burned in pockets of chaos, a quieter shift occurred. Authority relocated, not officially, not ceremonially, psychologically. The crowd did not debate governance. It chose familiarity. Familiarity felt safer than abstraction. In this confusion, Caesar's heir returned. Octavian was young, quiet, easily underestimated. He did not arrive demanding loyalty. He observed, he learned, he allowed others to exhaust themselves. Power after violence does not belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the most patient. Octavian understood that the crowd's choice had already been made. They had chosen continuity over uncertainty. All that remained was to embody it convincingly. Antony and Octavian would soon align, not out of affection, but necessity. The crowd's anger needed direction. The conspirators provided convenient targets. Vengeance organizes chaos. It gives emotion a task. The Republic, meanwhile, remained silent. It had no face to mourn, no body to display, no gifts to reveal. It existed only as memory, and memory struggles against immediacy. What the crowd did that day was not deliberate. They did not vote for empire. They did not reject Republican ideals explicitly. They chose stability because it felt close enough to touch. In doing so, they shaped the future without naming it. The conspirators had believed that removing Caesar would restore balance. Instead, it clarified preference. Rome preferred order that functioned to ideals that waited. That preference was not new. It had been forming quietly for years. The funeral did not crown an emperor. It did something more subtle. It removed the final obstacle to accepting one. Once the crowd expressed what it feared losing, power rearranged itself accordingly. By nightfall, the city was altered, not rebuilt, altered. The Republic still existed on paper. Its spirit, however, had migrated. It now resided in individuals rather than institutions. That shift is difficult to reverse. Crowds rarely understand the choices they make. They act from emotion, not foresight. But history records outcomes, not intentions. On that day, Rome chose continuity through people rather than process. Caesar was gone. The Republic remained formally intact. But the crowd's response revealed a truth no decree could conceal. Rome no longer trusted systems to protect it. It trusted figures. That trust would soon be tested, reshaped, and claimed by someone far less forgiving than Caesar. The funeral closed one chapter. It opened another that could no longer pretend to belong to the old world. This part of the story ends as Rome quiets again. Ash settles, streets empty, doors close. People return home believing they have expressed grief and anger. They have done more than that. They have signaled readiness. The empire does not arrive with trumpets. It arrives when a crowd chooses familiarity over uncertainty and never looks back. The cleanup that pretended to be justice. After the funeral, Rome did not calm down. It reorganized its anger. Anger rarely evaporates on its own. It looks for shape, for direction, for something that resembles purpose. In the days that followed, the city learned a familiar lesson. Removing a leader does not remove the need for leadership. It simply transfers that need to whoever stands still long enough to receive it. The men who had killed Caesar believed the hardest part was behind them. They had imagined history pausing, admiring their courage, then politely rewinding to a safer time. Instead, history accelerated. The city they claimed to liberate no longer recognized them as custodians. It saw them as authors of uncertainty. Uncertainty is not forgiven quickly. It is not even tolerated patiently. It is treated like smoke in a crowded room. People do not debate it. They rush to escape it, and they blame whoever lit the fire. Brutus and Cassius tried to speak to the public to explain the act as a gift. The public responded with the oldest political question. Did we ask for this? That question is quiet, but it is lethal. It is the sound of legitimacy walking away. Soon the conspirators were not marching through Rome with clean consciences. They were moving between safe houses guarded by friends who were suddenly unsure whether friendship was still a good investment. So they fled, and the speed of that flight said more than any speech could. Some slipped out of Rome under cover of night. Others clung to the edges of the city, waiting for a mood swing that never came. They had planned the act, not the aftermath. They had assumed that once Caesar was gone, the Republic would simply rise from the floor like a man waking refreshed from a nap. Instead, the Republic remained absent, and the city remained human, frightened, grieving, and irritated that anyone expected it to perform gratitude on command. Mark Antony did not need to chase them immediately. He let the city do what crowds do best. He let it remember what it had liked. Stability, bread, games, predictability. The conspirators could offer principles. Antony could offer a direction for feelings that were already burning. He did not frame the moment as political complexity. He framed it as betrayal. Betrayal is easy to understand. Betrayal requires a response. And then another figure entered the story with the quiet confidence of someone who knows that chaos is a ladder, but prefers to climb it without announcing each step. Octavian. 19 years old, fresh from the margins, carrying a name that suddenly mattered more than his age. Caesar's adopted heir. The conspirators underestimated him immediately, which was generous of them because it gave him time. Time is the most valuable resource in politics, and Octavian spent it the way careful people spend money, slowly, deliberately, and always with a hidden reserve. At first, Rome did not see him as a leader. Rome saw him as a symbol. Symbols are powerful because they do not need to speak. They simply stand there and collect emotion. Octavian began collecting. He aligned himself with Caesar's veterans. He secured legitimacy through inheritance. He let Antony do the loud work while he did the quiet work. In Roman politics, loud work draws attention. Quiet work collects power. Antony and Octavian, despite their differences, had a shared problem. The conspirators were alive. The conspirators represented unresolved tension. As long as Brutus and Cassius remained breathing and organizing, Rome could not pretend the matter was closed. Closure was needed, not for morality, but for sleep. Rome wanted to sleep. Exhaustion makes citizens practical. So the cleanup began, and it pretended to be justice. This is how political violence becomes socially acceptable. You do not call it revenge. Revenge sounds personal, chaotic, uncontrolled. You call it law. You call it stability. You call it the state protecting itself. Rome loved these words because they sounded like the Republic, and Rome still liked to believe it was the Republic, even while leaning on a structure that no longer resembled its old balance. The prescriptions arrived as paperwork, which is always a comforting disguise. Names on lists, property seized, friends turning cautious, neighbors suddenly very interested in minding their own business. It was efficient. It was official. It was also a reminder that the state can always find a legal vocabulary for whatever it wants to do. The Republic had once claimed to fear kings. Now it discovered it feared disorder more. People died. Some were conspirators. Some were merely inconvenient. That is the nature of lists. They start with principle and end with profit. Wealth moved hands quickly. Grudges found excuses. Rome watched the process the way it watched storms, with resignation and a careful hope that the lightning would strike someone else's roof. Meanwhile, Brutus and Cassius gathered strength in the east. They raised armies not as criminals, but as men insisting they still represented something noble. They framed their cause as liberty. Liberty is a beautiful word. It is also a word that becomes difficult to defend once you are recruiting soldiers and collecting taxes to fund the defense of it. War changes vocabulary. It turns ideals into supply problems. The confrontation that followed was less a philosophical clash than a practical one. Two camps meeting with legions that cared more about pay and loyalty than political theory. Battles do not argue. They decide. And when they decided at Philippi, they decided brutally. The conspirators lost. Their forces collapsed. Their final options narrowed to the most private forms of escape. Brutus and Cassius did not return to Rome as triumphant liberators. They vanished into the same darkness that follows most failed revolutions. Rome absorbed their disappearance with a kind of weary acceptance. The city had wanted the uncertainty to end. It did. Not neatly, not morally, simply. With fewer living voices left to dispute the narrative became easier to manage. But the cleanup did not bring peace. It brought a pause, and pauses are deceptive. The alliance that had carried vengeance began to fray. Antony and Octavian had tolerated each other because they had needed each other. Need fades. Ambition remains. Antony relied on charisma and the loyalty of soldiers who liked familiarity. He enjoyed power as presence, public, visible, theatrical. Octavian relied on structure. He enjoyed power as inevitability, quiet, administrative, patient. These are different appetites. Different appetites do not share a table for long. Rome watched them circle each other. It had seen this pattern before. Strong men unite to remove threats. Strong men then discover that the only remaining threat is the other strong man. The city could predict the arc of the drama even if it did not know the dates. The final break arrived as these breaks always do. Through accusations framed as principle, each claimed the other endangered Rome. Each promised restoration. Restoration is the safest lie in politics because it allows people to believe they are not moving forward into something unknown. They are merely returning home, even when the home no longer. Civil war returned because Rome had become allergic to shared power. Shared power requires trust. Trust had been stabbed on the Senate floor. And once trust is gone, politics becomes logistics again. Armies, money, loyalty, who controls what, who can hold it. Octavian won, not through loud brilliance, but through endurance and planning. He outlasted Antony's theatrical strength with a colder, steadier grip. When Antony fell, Rome did not celebrate loudly. It exhaled. Loud celebrations belong to people who feel safe. Rome did not feel safe. It felt tired, and tiredness prefers quiet victories. Now Octavian held what Caesar had held, and more, but he learned from Caesar's mistakes. He understood Rome's fear of the word king. He understood that symbols matter as much as laws. So he did not present himself as a monarch. He presented himself as a restorer, a guardian, a man returning the republic to health. He kept the Senate standing. He kept elections alive. He kept rituals intact. He preserved the shell carefully because people sleep better when familiar shapes remain in place. Inside that shell, power relocated. It concentrated. It hardened. It became routine. Routine is the true birth of empire, not a crown, not a proclamation. Routine. The moment citizens stop expecting change and start expecting continuity under one hand. The cleanup had pretended to be justice. It had been a transition. Rome told itself it had punished criminals and saved the republic. In practice, it had taught itself to accept permanent authority so long as it arrived quietly, wearing the old language like a borrowed cloak. This part ends without fireworks because Rome no longer needed them. It needed sleep. It needed predictable mornings. It needed grain that arrived on time and streets that did not erupt into sudden panic. Octavian understood that. He offered less drama and more order. And Rome, exhausted by principle and chaos alike, accepted the offer. The quiet shape of what replaced the Republic. Rome did not wake up one morning and realize it had become something else. There was no announcement, no trumpet, no moment where the city collectively paused and said, "This is different now." Change arrived the way night arrives when you are tired. Gradually, softly, without asking permission. Octavian did not rule like a conqueror. He ruled like a custodian. That distinction mattered. Rome had learned painfully that loud power attracted knives. Quiet power attracted acceptance. He presented himself not as a new beginning, but as a continuation. Continuation feels safe. It allows people to believe they have not lost anything essential. The Republic remained. On paper, in ritual, in language. Senators still met. Votes were still cast. Offices still existed. Everything familiar stayed where it was supposed to be. The only thing that changed was consequence. Decisions no longer wandered unpredictably through debate. They arrived already shaped, already approved, already inevitable. Octavian understood that Rome did not want innovation. It wanted relief. Relief from instability, relief from argument, relief from the exhausting performance of pretending that everyone mattered equally when everyone knew they did not. He offered relief without forcing confession. He took titles carefully, slowly, each one justified, each one framed as responsibility rather than ambition. He refused crowns and accepted duties. He declined theatrical authority and accumulated functional authority. Rome watched this with cautious approval. The city had become good at recognizing what felt calmer than before. When Octavian finally accepted the name Augustus, it did not feel like a coronation. It felt like a conclusion to paperwork that had been filling itself out for years. The word emperor did not yet dominate public speech. The illusion of restoration still held. People told themselves the Republic had been repaired. Repaired things look familiar. That is how you know they work. Augustus ruled through balance rather than domination, or at least through the appearance of balance. He allowed the Senate to retain dignity. Dignity is cheaper than power and easier to distribute. Senators spoke, Augustus listened, or appeared to. That appearance was enough. Most people do not need to be heard. They need to believe they could be. The military changed quietly. Loyalty realigned. Soldiers no longer served abstract institutions. They served individuals who ensured pay, land, and survival. This was not framed as corruption. It was framed as efficiency. Efficient systems are rarely questioned by those who benefit from them. The provinces stabilized, roads functioned, trade flowed, the calendar adjusted. Time itself seemed to align more neatly. Rome measured success not by freedom, but by predictability. Predictability is seductive. It promises rest. The generation that remembered the old republic aged and faded. Their stories grew softer with retelling, Sharp edges became anecdotes. Younger Romans knew chaos only as a memory they had not lived. They knew Augustus as presence rather than solution. Presence feels natural when it has always been there. History often frames this moment as transformation. In truth, it was accommodation. Rome adjusted its expectations. It learned to live within narrower political possibility in exchange for wider personal security. This trait is rarely dramatic. It is made quietly, one ordinary day at a time. Caesar's shadow lingered, not as warning, as foundation. His assassination became lesson rather than trauma. Do not move too fast. Do not make permanence obvious. Do not frighten the men who still believe they matter. Augustus followed these lessons carefully. He did not rush reforms. He layered them. He let people forget the sequence. Forgetting sequence is important. When people forget how something began, they accept where it ends more easily. Rome became an empire without ever admitting it wanted one. It told itself it had avoided monarchy. It told itself it had preserved tradition. These stories mattered. They allowed pride to survive adjustment. The irony is quiet. Caesar was killed for threatening an idea. Augustus preserved the shape of that idea while hollowing it gently. He proved that Rome did not fear kings. It feared disruption. Kings are acceptable when they arrive without drama. The Republic did not die on the Senate floor. It died later in comfort. It died when people stopped expecting participation and started expecting protection. Protection is easier to delegate. This does not mean Rome became cruel overnight. In many ways, life improved. Peace lengthened, borders held, cities prospered. For most people, politics receded from daily anxiety. That retreat felt like progress. Yet something subtle changed. Responsibility migrated upward. Agency narrowed. The habit of questioning softened. None of this was enforced aggressively. It was allowed. Allowance is the gentlest form of control. Augustus ruled for decades, long enough to normalize himself, long enough to become background. Background authority is the most stable kind. It does not need defense, it simply exists. By the time he died, Rome could not imagine functioning without a single guiding figure. The idea of returning to true republican uncertainty felt unnecessary, even childish. The Republic remained as memory, respected but impractical, like an heirloom tool no longer used. Looking back, historians search for moments, crossings, knives, speeches. They matter, but they mislead. Rome's transformation was not decided in a single act. It was decided in accumulation, in fatigue, in preference. The men who killed Caesar believed they were preventing something. They prevented nothing. They accelerated everything. By removing the man who made power visible, they forced Rome to accept power that hid itself better. Caesar had been obvious. Augustus was patient. Obvious power provokes resistance. Patient power invites trust. Trust lulls. Lulling ends arguments. This story does not end with condemnation. It ends with recognition. Rome chose what many societies choose when exhausted: order over participation, calm over uncertainty, familiar authority over abstract ideals. The choice was understandable. It was human. That is what makes it enduring. As night settles over the city, the streets are quiet. Lamps glow. Guards walk predictable routes. People sleep knowing tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to be manageable. That resemblance is the final triumph of empire. The Republic still lives in words, in lessons, in warnings. But Rome no longer needs it to function. And when a society no longer needs an idea, the idea becomes history. The empire does not announce itself. It tucks you in. It lowers the lights. It tells you that you are safe now, that nothing urgent requires your attention, that someone else will handle the difficult parts. And Rome, having lived through enough chaos to appreciate the offer, closes its eyes and agrees. The story ends not with a shout, but with sleep.